Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar from the Supporting Preparedness Article 6 Cooperation Program, a consortium made of Carbon Limits, GGI, KPC, GFA, UNEP Environment Program, Copenhagen Climate Center, and supported by IKI and the federal government of Germany on the topic of assessment of Colombian independent crediting mechanisms for Article 6.2. It's good to have more than 80 people in the room from different parts of the world and also from Colombia. Thank you very much for joining. I am your host, Ivan Darío Valencia. I'm also the project manager from Spark in Colombia at the Global Green Growth Institute. And today we have a very important presentation from Carbon Limits, our partner in the consortium, which will present this new publication that we have just launched. So I've just discussed about the Spark program, which focuses on supporting Article 6 preparedness in 4 countries, in Thailand, Pakistan, Zambia, and Colombia, but also has 2 global components, a community of practice for Article 6 implementing countries, focusing on academia, and also an Article 6 toolbox that is for use. It has been published on our website, spar6c.org, and is useful for all countries in the world that are undertaking the Article 6 journey. Within each of the 4 countries, we have work on medium and long-term emissions planning, on development of governance framework for Article 6 and the regulatory framework, and also developing mitigation activities that will be eligible and will be selected for Article 6 in the different countries. Of course, there's a capacity building component throughout the whole program, involving the private sector as well, of course, as the public institutions responsible for Article 6. So today we will start with some welcoming remarks, followed by an introduction to the topic. Then we'll touch upon the international context on Article 6 and carbon market integrity, followed by the assessment framework that we are presenting today on the assessment of independent crediting mechanisms, finalizing with the national focus on the 3 independent standards assessed from Colombia. And last, at 9 o'clock, we will attempt to start the Q&A session for 20 minutes. So to start us off with some welcoming remarks, I give the floor to Marshall Brown. So Marshall is the Deputy Director and Head of Readiness at the Carbon Finance Department at GGGI in our headquarters in Seoul, Korea. So Marshall, very glad to have you here. You have the floor.
Thanks, Ivan. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes, but we can't see you.
Oh, you can't see me at all.
He's visible. I see him on my screen.
Great. No, thanks, Ivan, for that introduction. I really like to just welcome everybody to the webinar. I see we have 111 participants, which is really fantastic. Great to see turnout for another Spark webinar. Spark is a global program, and part of the intention of the global nature is that we are able to share experiences across our different country partners' different implementation experiences across the 4 countries. And it's great that we can dig into a specific case here in Colombia and share that now with the rest of the world. So I think this report is really unique and special in that it really digs into an important and maybe perceived as complex area of decision making as countries are developing their Article 6 strategies and authorization criteria. They are looking at what methodologies and standards can be applicable in their national context. And Colombia is a really special case because they have so much great experience in terms of voluntary carbon market. participation, that the standards and methodologies that are applied in the Colombian context are already being applied in the region and globally. So we had to ask ourselves the question, out of this great work that's been done in Colombia, what is relevant for the rest of the world? And also then zooming out, what is relevant in terms of the process of selecting and assessing methodologies and standards for a country, for your own country's individual authorization decision making. So, of course, the team is going to explain it to you more, but I would like to congratulate the team of folks from Spark who have worked on this. Very much, very high praise and thanks to Ivan and Randall and Paula and the rest of the team, who came up with the idea to even do this analysis and share it with the world, in the first place, and pulled it off quite well. So looking forward to sharing that and hope that everybody continues to see this and the rest of the materials out of Spark as useful, and looking forward to hearing the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marshall. So let's start. So I will start with the introduction. Just to ask attendees, if you have any questions, while the presentation is going on, you can start posting them on the webinar chat, and we'll accumulate them till the Q&A session. So this is our report. It has been published on our website. You can download it at sparc6c.org or using the QR code here on the slide. We'll project it again at the end. So this was recently published. It's called Assessment of Colombian Independent Crediting Mechanisms and Methodologies for Article 6.2 Usage. The principal authors are Paula Hoffman and Randall Spandil Fescher, and they are both joining us today, and Martin Polstad from Carbon Limits, with reviewers from GGGI, independent consultancies, UNEP, KPC, and other carbon limits contributors. We will definitely acknowledge the three standards that were assessed: BioCarbon standard, COLCX, and Cercarbono. They were very kind in providing us their time, their constructive collaboration, the consultations throughout this consultation and engagement process. So what is the objective of the assessment? We wanted to assess the readiness of Colombian independent crediting mechanisms for international cooperation under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. Specifically, given that Article 6.2, of course, has generic guidance from the CMA, we needed to generate an assessment framework. So we needed to develop a structured assessment framework, and for that, it was built on parts of the ICBCM core carbon principles, the 6.4 mechanism or PACM, and CORSIA supplementing some criteria. Throughout the assessment, some key gaps were identified at the program level, but also at the methodology level to identify gaps, risk, and implementation challenges. And finally, the report provides some actionable recommendations to strengthen carbon market governance and support Article 6 implementation in Colombia, but also offering insights for other countries considering the use of these independent crediting mechanisms for 6.2 agreements. So overall, the assessment reviewed these three programs and the program rules of their program rules and 5 methodologies. These programs have successfully certified projects and expanded internationally, as we can see here. So the methodologies that were evaluated, 3 come from Cercarbono, 1 RED Plus methodology, 1 reforestation methodology, and 1 renewable energy methodology. We also assessed a RED Plus methodology for COLCX and a biomethanization methodology for BioCarbon standard. We attempted to also look at a RED Plus methodology from BioCarbon standard, but it was in the process of being adjusted and modified, so we stopped that assessment for that reason. Overall, as for those of you that are not familiar with these standards, so although they are based in Colombia, they have two of them at least have international outreach. Cercarbono in particular has grown to 23 countries with more than 265 projects. Of course, this cutoff was at the date of the assessment. The numbers may have changed, and 7 methodologies developed in-house. COLCX is focused on Colombia with 40 projects and 4 in-house methodologies, while BioCarbon Standard has more than 51 projects in 15 countries with 12 in-house methodologies. So of course, we couldn't cover all the methodologies. That would have been a very big workload, but we attempted to cover across different sectors. So for now, to speak more in detail about the assessment and the context, so I will give the floor to one of the principal authors, Randall Spalding Fisher from Carbon Limits. Randall, very glad to have you here. You have the floor.
Yeah, thanks very much, Yvonne, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So what I'm going to do is provide a bit of context, because you might say, well, what is it we're assessing these standards against? What does the word quality or integrity even mean? So I'm going to talk a little bit about more generically, what are the types of environmental integrity criteria that carbon credits have to meet, and how can we think about assessing that quality? So if we go to the next slide, the most commonly used definition of environmental integrity is that greenhouse gas emissions can't increase as a result of using carbon crediting, right? At a minimum, they have to stay the same as a scenario without carbon crediting. So typically across almost all mechanisms, you'll see this terminology, the language of, for example, conservative estimates of emission reductions, projects that are additional. In other words, they wouldn't have happened without the impact of the crediting mechanism, that the reductions or removals are permanent, that they're verified by a third party, they're not double counted. So this has been true for more than 2 decades. Now, the next slide, we'll see the Paris Agreement then added another layer onto this. So the Paris Agreement says here high quality doesn't just mean conservative and permanent and verified. It also means that the baseline for quantifying the emission reductions has to be below business as usual. It's not enough to compare your activity to just what would have happened. The baseline needs to be lower than that level. Then below, you'll see there are also in the Paris Agreement a number of quality issues related to the country as well. Do they have a robust accounting system to make sure mitigation outcomes are only being used by one country? Do they have a stringent target at the national level? Are they increasing their ambition? Our focus, though, really is going to be on this first one. It's going to be on, do these crediting mechanisms meet this kind of Paris Agreement version of environmental integrity and quality? So go to the next slide. Another important distinction here is the different kinds of crediting mechanisms. Now, these used to be largely independent, but the Paris Agreement now brings all of these types together. So we have international mechanisms. So that's the CDM from the Kyoto Protocol. It's now the PACM, or the new 6.4 mechanism. Yvonne already used this term. We talk about independent crediting mechanisms. Traditionally, these were the big ones, international ones run by NGOs or private companies like Gold Standard Vera, Climate Action Reserve, but of course now it includes the ones in Colombia as well. Now those started maybe at a regional or national level, but as Yvonne mentioned, they're now becoming international. But for example, Thailand and Australia, the Canadian provinces, they all have mechanisms that are focused just on a specific jurisdiction or sub-level of that jurisdiction. And then you have bilateral approaches. So what Japan has done, what Switzerland to the CLIC Foundation has done, often crediting approaches that are agreed simply between 2 countries. And that's the kind of boundary of their activity. So on to the next slide. Now, the big change, so all these different kinds of crediting mechanisms were operating basically independently. The CDM and PACM, they do have this oversight of the parties to those agreements, but basically they were independent. And a few years ago, partly in response to a lot of challenges in the carbon market, we started to see these industry-wide initiatives and external third parties like rating agencies emerge to basically certify the certifiers, or check the people who are actually doing the certification of emission reductions. And this, I think, is a really, really positive development. If we can go to the next slide. So on one hand, you had the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. This is the ICVCM. So this is an industry-wide body whose sole purpose really is to really improve the overall quality of the market by evaluating what the program rules and the methodological approaches in these different mechanisms, what they mean for environmental integrity. CCQI was also a more research-oriented initiative that started a lot of this kind of industry-wide assessments as well. And then you have B0, Silvera, and COLCX Global are all independent rating agencies of carbon credits. So they've also come up with metrics that look across a wide variety of standards and methodologies. How do we actually think about quality? So this means that both, project developers, of course, can use this to try to increase the integrity and low risk, but also what Paolo will be talking about is countries can use these frameworks to think about, are we comfortable using particular systems and methodologies for our international collaboration under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement? All right, next slide. And the last thing I'll say is quality makes a difference to the market. This is not just some conceptual idea. It actually has real impacts, right? Because if you don't have good quality, there could be reputational damage, legal exposure, etc. And so what COLCX Global, one of the rating agencies, started to do with Clear Blue Markets is they melded or they integrated the pricing data that Clear Blue had with the quality ratings. So they were able to say, what's the average price for a credit from projects with different levels of quality? And you can see for a while it was a muddle. But over the last year, there's a clear breakout that the high quality projects earn a significant premium. And I think this will be even more important going ahead to the future. So with that, I will turn it over to Paula to go through the detail of our work in Colombia.
Thank you, Randall. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Paula Hoffmann. I work as a consultant at Carbon Limits, and I've been one of the lead authors of the report on assessing the Colombia-based crediting mechanisms. And I'm, of course, a little bit biased, but I think it's a very interesting and relevant piece of work, and I'm very happy to present some of the findings to you today. So before I talk about the assessment framework that we created and how we created it and how it works, I would just like to spend a little bit more time talking about the why. And I know that many of you are, of course, very familiar with this topic, but I think it's important to mention that the Paris Agreement, with all its rules and governing bodies, has actually no jurisdiction over the independent crediting mechanisms, such as Cercarbono, COLCX, or BCR. But as Randall has already highlighted just now, carbon markets and crediting have been evolving in the context of the Paris Agreement, for example, with regards to environmental integrity standards. And we also look at the alignment between independent crediting mechanisms and Article 6, because the framework and the rules of Article 6 create the possibility to use these independent crediting mechanisms as the basis for Article 6.2 transactions. So governments can recognize these crediting mechanisms and their methodologies for the generation and issuance of ITMOs under their Article 6 cooperative approaches. But this is just in theory, of course. Next slide, please. And in practice, when authorizing ITMOs based on these crediting mechanisms and methodologies, host countries must ensure consistency with Article 6.2 requirements. And you can see these requirements or a shortened version of these requirements listed on the slides. So they include, for example, that mitigation outcomes are to be real, additional, and verified, that environmental integrity must be assured, so that we have robust and transparent governance, that we have good quality of mitigation outcomes, including, as Randall already mentioned, the below business as usual baselines. Governments need to ensure that risks of non-permanence are minimized, that human rights are respected, also to avoid negative environmental, economic, and social impacts, that there is contributions to the NDC, and also that mitigation outcomes are consistent with sustainable development priorities. And on top of that, also host countries must assure robust accounting and tracking and reporting of these outcomes. So again, these requirements are not something that is explicitly requested of the crediting mechanisms, but that's something that host governments must ensure that they are met. So if we want to use independent crediting mechanisms, some of this will have to get passed on to them, right? And this is where our assessment framework comes in. Because as you just saw, the Article 6.2 guidance is not very detailed. And this is why our team looked at other existing benchmarks, such as ICVCM, the rules from the Paris Agreement crediting mechanisms, and also CORSIA, in order to give a little bit flesh to the bone and to allow us to verify whether these requirements from Article 6.2 are met, and ultimately draw some conclusions also with regards to the alignment of the crediting mechanisms to those requirements. And I can tell you, one moment please, back to the other slide. I can tell you that this hasn't been a straightforward task, because we had to come up with something that was not excessively restrictive while also being specific enough in order to do the assessments. And in the end, we did this by applying a two-layered approach. So first we selected something from ICVCM or CORSIA or the PACM rules, and then we had to make additional adjustments or enhancements in order to make sure that what we selected actually reflects Article 6.2 properly. Next slide, please. Now. And what we also had to think about is the level at which the Article 6.2 requirements are most relevant, right? So this has to do with how the crediting mechanisms and methodologies are structured, because some of the requirements have mostly implications for the governance frameworks of the crediting mechanisms and the operational guidelines, whereas others are more relevant at the level of the individual methodologies. And on the slide, you can see what we came up with in this regard. So for example, the requirements relating to robust governance and transparency, we expected to be addressed at the level of the program rules, whereas a requirement such as contribute to net zero transition, we felt is rather inherent to the individual methodology and the activity type. And some other requirements, of course, like robust quantification or sustainable development, are relevant for both program rules and methodologies. Next slide, please. So all of this was maybe a little bit abstract. So I think it's good to look at an example of how this actually looks in practice in the assessment framework. Next slide. And yeah, so here you can see, for example, an excerpt from the guidance text from Article 6.2. Where it states that host parties should describe how each approach ensures environmental integrity, including through the quality of mitigation outcomes, through conservative reference levels, baselines set in a conservative way, and below business as usual emissions. So what we then did is at the program level, we turned this into specific questions. So we were asking, for example, whether the program rules define the length of crediting periods, or whether they give guidance on the renewal of crediting periods, or whether they require that methodologies must undergo third-party verification before being approved or revised. And next click, please. At the methodology level, for the same criterion for robust quantification, we rather looked at things like the approaches to quantification of reductions and removals, how the accounting for uncertainty works, how baselines below business as usual are set, and lots of other specific requirements. And we did this essentially for every requirement that was set out in the Article 6.2 guidance. Next slide. And all in all, we think that this has led to an assessment framework that offers a very practical tool for host country governments, but also crediting mechanisms and other market stakeholders who want to build their carbon markets and rules for carbon crediting around Article 6.2. And just on a last note, it is important to bear in mind when looking at this framework that it really only covers the Article 6.2 guidance for the international transfer of ITMOs, so the SEMA decisions, and it does not cover other relevant requirements, for example, in the context of the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, such as the specific Article 6.4 rules, nor does it cover any country-specific rules under bilateral or multilateral agreements. And this brings me to the results of the assessment that we conducted on Cercarbono, COLCX, and BCR, including their program rules, but also the methodologies that Ivan mentioned earlier. And before going into the actual results of the assessment, I would just like to say a few words on the assessment process. We can keep the slide, thank you. Yeah, thanks. So this assessment basically followed a two-step approach. First, we looked at the publicly available documentation of the rules, methodologies, and tools of the crediting mechanisms. And as Ivan mentioned earlier, during this process, we also consulted with the crediting mechanisms because we wanted to make sure that we didn't miss anything or that we didn't misinterpret anything. And in these conversations with the mechanisms, we actually found out that many of these documents that we were looking at were already being updated or were already undergoing revisions because some of these crediting mechanisms were preparing for their applications, for example, for ICVCM and ICROA, and were revising the documents for that reason. So this is why we had to set a cutoff date, which was in mid-2025. And we said we can't take any changes to these documents into account after this. So the results of the analysis of the public documentation, which you can see in the table marked in red, or it's rather burgundy, I think, and in yellow and in green. They are time-bound, and they also don't constitute a definite judgment on whether these mechanisms fully meet Article 6.2 requirements, but they should be understood as an initial evaluation based on our assessment framework and also based on our expert judgment. And then in a second step, we examined a number of implementation concerns that were raised by external sources, such as the media and investigative sources. And we did this because we recognized that the real-world application of program rules and methodologies can sometimes differ from what we read in black and white on the paper. And you can see the findings from these case studies highlighted in the table with the red boxes. And what you will also see is that sometimes they align with the gaps that we identified in the documents. So this is, for example, if you see a red box around a red or a yellow score. But sometimes they also flag potential discrepancies. So, for example, a red box around green. And what you're seeing on the screen now is really just a snapshot of the whole assessment of requirements at the program level. But I think overall, I can say here that we have identified several areas of improvement for the program rules and procedures to strengthen alignment with Article 6.2. Next slide, please. Now, some of these gaps that we identified actually reflect the novelty of some of the Article 6.2 requirements that have not been traditionally part of the independent crediting mechanism rules. So this is, for example, with regard to ensuring that corresponding adjustments are implemented. Or considering things like host country authorization or Article 6 reporting. These are elements that are new with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And of course, it takes some time and effort to integrate this into program rules and documentation. And we were actually very excited to see that some of them had already been incorporated by some of the standards. So real progress there. Next slide, please. And as I said earlier, sometimes the case studies that we reviewed with concerns regarding implementation, they conflicted with what we read in black and white in the documents. So what we've seen is, for example, that all three crediting mechanisms show a strong commitment to safeguards and human rights. But then in practice, in media news, there are still cases that suggest that they may not have always been applied properly in practice. Next slide, please. And our recommendations for improvements of the program rules and procedures, they include a couple of points. Can you click next, please? So, for example, we're recommending to the crediting mechanisms that they should work on strengthening independence and accountability of their governance boards, for example, by publishing their bylaws and providing financial disclosures, but also to improve registry transparency, for example, by disclosing credit buyers and the end purposes, including Article 6 authorizations. Other recommendations include to enhance cross-registry coordination and data sharing to prevent double counting and improve credit tracking for Article 6, and to ensure greater transparency and accessibility of project information. Next click, please. We also provide some recommendations for host governments, such as the government of Colombia, to support the crediting mechanisms in the process of Article 6.2 alignment, if wished. And this could be, for example, to define a strategic national approach to carbon markets and Article 6 participation, including some guidance for the alignment of crediting mechanisms and activities with NDC targets and sustainable development priorities, but also some guidance, for example, on VVB integrity, requiring crediting mechanisms to establish oversight mechanisms. And then, of course, it is helpful to establish a robust legal and institutional framework to enforce safeguards, and particularly the Cancun safeguards for REDD+ projects to ensure the inclusion and proper protection of local communities and indigenous people and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. So regarding methodologies, for the ones that we looked at, we also note that key improvements are still needed to meet Article 6.2 requirements. And here on the slides, you can just see a couple of examples. So for example, prior consideration as a criterion for demonstrating additionality had not yet been incorporated by all the crediting mechanisms. And while we saw that all methodologies were requiring operational and management plans for monitoring, and were specifying the monitoring approaches for the relevant parameters, we did not always find rules on conservativeness or taking into account uncertainties in the monitoring process. Next slide. And you can also see that, for example, improvements are necessary for most methodologies with regards to ensuring the conservative quantification or determining sources of leakage. Next slide, please. And then we saw a number of gaps, especially in REDD+ and AFALU methodologies, so for nature-based activities. And these challenges that we found are not necessarily unique to the methodologies of the Colombia-based crediting mechanisms, but they are generally associated with these activity types. And this is due to the technical complexity of forest carbon accounting, and also the potential impacts, social and environmental impacts that these activities can have. So baseline setting and perverse incentives there that are also highlighted as gaps in our assessment is something that has been much debated in relation to REDD+ in the past few years. Next slide. And also ensuring permanence of emission reductions and removals in nature-based activities such as REDD+ or afforestation and reforestation, forest restoration has been a big topic in the last years. And there have been a number of new requirements that emerged out of this debate, such as establishing buffer mechanisms and reserves and having requirements for longer monitoring and compensation periods, or to differentiate, clearly differentiate between avoidable and unavoidable reversals. And here we also found in our assessment that some of these requirements were not yet reflected in the rules of the Colombia-based mechanisms. So can you click one more, please? Thanks. So it's not surprising that then establishing credible REDD+ baselines is also the key focus in our recommendations for methodology improvements. In general, also with respect to other methodologies, we recommend the accrediting mechanisms to closely follow global developments, including the continuous updates from the Paris Agreement supervisory body with regards to specific rules, and then also potentially explore where appropriate areas of alignment with Paris Agreement crediting mechanism approved version of tools and related methodologies, because in certain cases these may exceed the more general requirements of Article 6.2, but they can provide a forum for orientation as well. And also to explore, in the context of REDD+ specifically, whether deforestation activity data can be developed by independent high-quality data providers or in collaboration with host governments in order to reduce the overestimation risks and costs that are related to these types of activities and the modes of baseline setting for these types of activities. And yeah, we also have some recommendations for host governments on how they can support Article 6 alignment at the methodology level, and these also particularly focus on REDD+ activities. So one of the recommendations that we provide is, for example, that governments such as the government of Colombia should continue to improve the forest reference emission level data, which is often used in these types of projects for baseline setting in order to reduce uncertainties. And if you want to learn more about this practice and also the use of forest reference emissions level data, then I ask you to check out the report. We have some interesting insights into that in there as well. And we're also recommending that the governments could explore potential partnerships with crediting mechanisms to develop deforestation activity data for robust project level REDD+ baselines. And yeah, this could be, for example, coupled with jurisdictional data. And I think this already brings me to my last slide, and I know that we're well ahead of time, but maybe that's good, then we can just have a couple more questions. So overall, the results of our assessment have shown that Colombia's independent crediting mechanisms have established important foundations, but also still require targeted enhancements to fully align with Article 6.2. Can you click next? At the level of program rules and procedures, the mechanisms have taken meaningful steps, such as also in the context of applying for integrity bodies in the voluntary carbon markets and revising the documentation as a result. But we see that based on the documents that we reviewed, also further improvements are needed to ensure transparency and accountability and environmental integrity. And across the crediting programs, there are also key methodology improvements needed in order to meet Article 6.2 requirements. And this is particularly to address challenges in RED+ activities, in the RED+ methodologies that we reviewed. But we are aware that the results of our assessment, they often also reflect the technical complexities of carbon accounting and, as I mentioned before, the time and effort that is needed to adopt to the internationally evolving requirements, and also sometimes complexities due to potential social and environmental impacts of certain activity types that may look different on the ground than on paper. And we find that host governments, such as the Colombian governments, can support independent crediting mechanisms in this process if they wish to do so. For example, if they wish to recognize these crediting mechanisms for Article 6 transfers, and they can do so by providing specific policy guidance, taking on an oversight role, and establishing the respective legal and institutional frameworks to make sure that these processes are aligned with national priorities. Yeah, so I hope this presentation has given you a good overview. And of course, I encourage everyone to read the report if you're curious about the details, because this was really just a snapshot. And yeah, my colleagues and I, we also look forward to take your questions now.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, Randall, for your presentation. Yes, we finished ahead of time the presentation, so we have ample time for questions and answers. So I would ask my colleagues to display their Q&R code promptly in the next slide, so we can have an opportunity for you to look at the report again. But in the meantime, let's go for some questions. We have some questions in the Q&A module, and we also so we can go through them. We also have a hand raised, so maybe we can start with the person that has the raised hand. Ms. Viviana Duarte, if you want to ask the question and to whom you are asking the question to. Are you able to speak? I'm not sure. Well, I don't hear Viviana, so let's go with the questions in the Q&A module. So we have a question from Anna Tiarvar. The voluntary market and the compliance market also adding jurisdictional considerations, how will those meet on a national level? So I guess this can go to Paula.
Yeah, sure. And maybe I can say a couple of things, but in case I don't understand the question properly, we could clarify the question. So what I can say is that in our assessment, we looked at RED+ methodologies, and I think that this is what the question is referring to. For project-based implementation, we didn't consider any jurisdictional scale RED+. And because this is a whole different debate, and yeah, so we really focus on the assessment of project-based RED+, but there are, of course, the same big questions or similar questions, both for project-based RED+ and jurisdictional, and also in terms of their interaction. So that's why in our recommendations, we recommend also a collaboration between the governments and the crediting mechanisms in order to align on the developments at the jurisdictional level, and also the data and forest reference emissions levels, and what is happening at the project levels. Does this answer your question?
Thank you, Paula. Yeah, Anna can write there or open her mic if it doesn't. I believe it was a great answer. Then Abira Babar Mahmood asks, are the standards using MOF-USS defined FNRB, that's fraction of non-renewable biomass values, or locally derived data from RED Plus? Which one is more reliable and is locally developed data slash FNRB value acceptable? Oh, well, this is a very detailed question. Not sure if, Paula, you can take that.
Here I would maybe refer to our report and
I can also say something. I can also add something to it, Paula.
Yeah.
Just kind of so in a way, there are two kind of parallel debates here that they're referring to for the people who don't know what MOFAS means. So there's been a lot of debate when you have clean cooking interventions, so improved cook stoves and things like that. The idea is that these reduce emissions because some of the biomass that's being used in cook stoves isn't replaced, so it's non-renewable. It's been cut down, and the forest cannot replenish it. So that this measure of the fraction of non-renewable biomass is the critical input for all clean cooking interventions. And there's been a debate about how accurate those are. And so the MOFAS model is currently one of the kind of leading ways and a much improved way to try to assess this. And if you see what's happening in the PACM right now, that it's definitely moving in that direction for these markets. That is not directly used for RED Plus in the sense that the idea of FNRB is it's more like a snapshot of right now how much of the wood that's being used, say, for household cooking is not going to be replaced. RED Plus baselines, of course, are forward-looking. We're trying to use a number of metrics, reference scenarios, etc., to project how much forest would be lost and then measure the actual achievement of the project against that. So these are related, but they're not exactly the same thing.
Thank you, Randall. Okay, so we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to start selecting them in order to prioritize the different topics. So we have a question from Rocio Rodriguez. How were the methodologies chosen for the assessment? So Paula or Randall, who wants to take that one?
Yeah, sure, I can answer to that. So we selected the methodologies. We wanted to have some methodologies that actually have credit issuances so that are representative of what's happening in the market. And this is also why I guess methodologies like the RED Plus ones or afforestation, reforestation ended up in the selection. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we cover different sectors because that's something has attraction in the market now doesn't mean that other things won't have in the future. And we also wanted to see how this compares. That's why we included, for example, the biomethanization and also the renewable energy one. And as Ivan mentioned earlier, we had originally some more methodologies within the scope, but we found out in the process of the review and the consultations with the standards that some of these were being severely updated. So we didn't include them in the final assessment.
Thank you, Paula. So I'll just display the QR code again, but the link is also in the chat. So let me go through a different, more general questions first from an anonymous attendee. Why didn't you include the international standards to compare with the Colombia ones? Maybe Randall, maybe you can take that one.
Well, I mean, number one, not enough time, right? So, I mean, essentially, we use some of the ICVCM framework as a proxy for that, right? Because this work is very time intensive. So reading through hundreds of pages of rules and evaluating them against dozens of criteria, it's just a big job. So rather than trying to compare these three to half a dozen others, we used, I mean, ICVCM, the assessment framework has essentially tried to kind of harmonize and codify what is best practice. So in a way, we use that as a proxy.
Thank you, Randall. Okay, let me go through different generic question. Colombia has an ambition from Jessica Wade Murphy. Colombia has an ambitious NDC with emission targets for 2030 and 2035 that seem unlikely to be met in practice given the current emissions trajectory. Do you think there's any potential for Article 6.2 or 6.2, 6.4 projects in Colombia given this NDC context? So I can answer that, and then maybe Randall and Paula can complement with their views. So this goes to other piece of work that Spark has undertaken with Colombia, looking at Article 6 not as a zero-sum game, as a mechanism that takes away from the NDC, because of course that's the implication of the corresponding adjustment, but also one that actually lives by the spirit of Article 6, that is to support NDC implementation. If you look at Article 6.1, that's how it's phrased. And how can Article 6 support NDCs both in the host country and the buyer country? Well, one option that we analyzed through the green economy model, and we are also having a webinar, by the way, on 18th or 19th of March about this analysis, and we're having a paper being released, a policy brief being released on it. We looked at the multiplier effect of Article 6. So basically, how can Article 6 deals be structured? How can there be a business model whereby Article 6 projects can create mitigation that to some extent remains in the country, whilst some, of course, are transferred abroad, or that the revenues are reinvested to some extent that the net effect is positive. So even if in a scenario where there is some deficit, Article 6 can help reduce that deficit by generating more activity, more mitigation action on the ground, even if some of those results, of course, are transferred internationally. Not sure, Randall, Paula, if you want to supplement that view?
Yeah, I could add a couple of things. So first of all, the question actually said, is there potential for 6.2 and 6.4 projects? There's potential for lots of projects, right? So the two separate questions. One is, can the crediting mechanisms generate lots of activity? Absolutely. But the separate question, I think what you're getting is it okay to transfer that, and is that going to compromise the NDC? So I would agree with Yvonne that there are different ways you can do that. You can have large programs, as he said, which only transfer a portion of the emission reductions. You can also focus your action on the kinds of activities that Colombia was not planning to use for their NDC, right? So there could be some, say, higher cost activity, maybe electrification of some transport, right? They're not the lower cost strategies that Colombia would necessarily choose to use to meet their unconditional commitments. So you can focus on that area. Or kind of building on what Yvonne said, you could have a technology that's relatively new, and you can say for the first 3, 4, 5 years, we will allow this and so allow some international transfers, but there's a sunset clause, a deliberate sunset clause, after which this will be only really for domestic use. And finally, there is a market for non-authorized credits, right? I mean, non-authorized credit is a fancy way of saying what carbon credits in the voluntary market have been for the last 20 years. In other words, you can still generate carbon market credits. These can be used by, say, companies to make claims that they've contributed to mitigation in a country. So we call them mitigation contribution claims. Not the same as offsets, but it's a claim to be supporting mitigation. And that does not then require an authorization under Article 6.2 because Colombia is not giving up those mitigation outcomes.
And what I can add, maybe just to come back to the recommendations in our report, is of course that is important. Should this Article 6 engagement be pursued, that there is a strategic national approach to carbon markets and the use of Article 6, including some guidelines on how this aligns with Colombia's NDC and sustainable development priorities and so on.
Thank you, Paula. Yes, and just to remind people, in the assessment, one of the criteria that was assessed was the contribution to the NDC. Another question from Nilam Sari. In some country context, I see important carbon data scattered outside formal registries. In the Colombia assessment, how did the team handle non-public information and ensure findings remained robust without overclaiming? Who wants to take that one?
You want to take that one, Paula?
Yeah,
Some
sure.
recommendations around registries, yeah?
Ivan, could you repeat the first part of the question, please?
In some country context, I see important carbon data scattered outside formal registries. In the Colombia assessment, how did the team handle non-public information and ensure findings remain robust without overclaiming?
Yes, so two things maybe. So first of all, for our assessment, we of course focused on the program rules of the crediting mechanism. So we didn't actually dig into the registries and did an analysis of how robust or how things are in practice. That to say, we did do a couple of case studies that I mentioned, where sometimes some of these issues of double issuance, for example, were raised. But what we came to a conclusion and then also gave a recommendation based on this through our assessment is that we actually recommend for the standards to enhance their cross-registry coordination and enable data sharing and to also be transparent in the project information that is available on the registries, including PDDs, and have a clear policy also on the confidentiality of information so that can be assured that transparency is remained also for outside stakeholders and not only within the project participants. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you, Paula. I'm reading the question from Alejandra Paredes. Hi, everyone. My name is Alejandra Paredes. I'm the Director of Corporate Affairs for BioCarbon Standard. The question is, what specific methodological and governance improvement are most critical for Colombia's independent carbon crediting mechanisms to fully align with Article 6.2 while ensuring transparency, environmental integrity, and accountability? So thank you, Alejandra, for the question. Paula?
Yeah, so with regard to the specific improvements, I think I would just recommend to look into our report because we went through all the requirements and the sub-criteria that we developed when developing the assessment framework in detail in the report and explicitly highlight kind of what are the gaps, but what are also things that are already implemented, that are already in place, that progress has been made. So I think that would be my short answer.
Thank you. Is there a raised hand? There was a raised hand, but they put it down. If you want to have a live question, you can also do that. But I don't see any hands anymore. So let's go to another question related to the governments. From Maxwell Annis, on your point about how governments can support independent crediting mechanisms, would it be beneficial or possible to set up a formal coordination channel to reduce authorization risk while still preserving the mechanism independence? Do you think an authorization risk exists in Colombia?
Randall, would you maybe like to take this one?
Sure. Yeah. So there are two things. You're asking about coordination, but you're also asking about authorization. I think that's a little bit separate. So could it be useful to have some coordination, especially with government? Absolutely. I mean, to some extent, the standards can all see what each other's rules are, right? Because they're public. But I can certainly see how there could be some benefit to the government bringing those together. But that's a little bit different. It's not up to crediting mechanisms to figure out authorization risk. That is not their role. The crediting mechanism, their role is to ensure high integrity credits. It's really government's responsibility to assess authorization risk. And so they can then decide, there could be lots of high quality credits from many different activity types. That does not mean that all of those should be authorized for international transfer, because the government, to decide that, needs to know what is our goal and how are we going to meet that goal, because whatever we want to use to meet that goal, we probably shouldn't give up internationally. So they're kind of related questions, but they're somewhat separate. And I guess also, as Jessica pointed out in her question, yes, there are some authorization risks. There are authorization risks in every country, though, right? And part of this is the legacy of the CDM, because the CDM, kind of by definition, I mean, the idea was to find the low-hanging fruit, because that's the stuff that was easiest to do. Now a lot of project developers are saying, okay, we have all these great projects. Now we want them authorized under the Paris Agreement. But the difficulty is, if they were the low-hanging fruit, that's probably also the activities that would be most beneficial for governments to use to meet their unconditional NDCs. So this is the clash you see sometimes, that very low abatement cost activities that were, in a way, the best thing to do under the CDM are now not the best thing for countries to be authorizing under 6.2. And I think it's going to take a little bit of time for the industry to kind of recognize that. And so clarity from governments, absolute clarity about what we will and won't authorize, is incredibly important for that reason, because that sends a signal to the market to say, if you want authorization, if you want the high prices for your credits, you need to go with these types of activity types.
Thank you. So let's move to other topics. The topic of RED Plus. There were a couple of questions from Joshua Sene. I was wondering how much sense it makes to focus so much on RED Plus forestry credits for Article 6.2 when buyer countries are beginning to exclude them. Switzerland, for example, states that they will not buy any RED Plus credits under Article 6.2. Anybody wants to answer? I also invite Marshall if he wants to contribute to any
Yeah, I can say a little
response.
bit of this, but Marshall should definitely comment. I mean, so first of all, Switzerland is actually a very small buyer when you look at the spectrum of what's. I mean, the big thing really is probably going to be whether the EU allows RED Plus credits, which we have no idea, because the EU is now potentially, after 2035, could become the largest buyer of those with the EU ETS. So I would say yes, certainly some countries have raised concern about this, and a lot of the early focus for most of the sovereign buyers has been on projects outside of land use because of the challenges. But I don't think that necessarily means that there's no market for RED Plus credits. I mean, I agree that it can be difficult, particularly jurisdictional RED, putting jurisdictional RED in Article 6.4, Article 6, that I think is pretty challenging, and we should approach that with immense caution. But I think project-based RED probably will find a place in this market. I just hope they will listen to the work of things like CCQI, ICBCM, and a lot of independent research. There are ways to make really good quality RED projects. It's not rocket science. There are ways to do it, but you have to have a commitment from the standards and a commitment from the developers to follow those suggestions.
So following on RED Plus, from John Sandoval, how should the industry manage the legacy risk of projects with inflated or flawed baselines that resist credit adjustments? Furthermore, how do we uphold rigorous integrity standards when project proponents leverage legal challenges or contractual demands to block necessary methodology updates? So maybe this is a bit outside of scope, but if Paula wants to have a go, please do.
Yeah, sure, I can try. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the issues that we also flagged in our review of the RED Plus methodologies, they're inherent to these activity types, and debates around them, especially the issue of inflated baselines and perverse incentives and baseline setting. It's been something that's been discussed in the markets for a while now, and has also led to a lot of reputational damage. That said, there are equally developments, I think, where crediting standards, academics, project developers have made incredible efforts on trying to fix these things, right? So we have Vera coming out with a methodology that also got ICVCM approval that relies on independent data providers in order to reduce some of the risks related to baseline settings that were inherent to the reference area approach that we know from the old projects. And I think there is also value in recommendations of enhancing communication and collaboration between project developers, governments, and crediting mechanisms on these issues. That would be my comment.
Yeah, I can just add a little bit of this. I mean, I would say most urgent step one is fix the rules now, right? In other words, like because every day that you don't fix the rules, you have more poor legacy credits, right? So step one is to do what needs to be done. And I think that what needs to be done is actually fairly clear out there. There are still some standards that were, but I think it's actually pretty clear. The interesting thing, though, is that the more, I mean, this risk, I think, is a little bit lower in the sense that credits only have an impact or a negative impact on the climate if somebody buys them and uses them, right? And I think given the kind of clear messages that are coming out about the need to improve the methodologies, when the improvements are there, I think what's possible is that a lot of the older credits simply won't be purchased, for better or for worse. And with the legal challenges, I mean, that's interesting. I think both in Colombia and internationally, there's pretty strong clarity in the rules about what happens at crediting period renewal, right? So every, say, 5 to 7 years, there's this reassessment in most standards, certainly reassessment of the baseline, often a requirement for methodological updates, et cetera. So that also needs to be very, very clear in the rules to prevent this kind of legal challenge. And I think most standards have it, but it could probably be improved. But people need to know in a way when they sign up to the terms of the registry system standard, that they will be required to update the baseline approach every X number of years. That's very important.
Thank you, Randall. So another question on red from Susana Vélez. Could you please give us more details on the comment about the improvement of forest reference emission levels in the host countries? What do you mean by this, Paula?
Yeah,
Paula?
sure.
Yeah.
So in the case of Colombia, right, both of the RED Plus methodologies that we reviewed from Cercarbono and from COLCX, they allow for, or they said that if the forest reference emission levels are available, then these should be reflected in the baseline setting. And one thing that we flagged in these approaches is not necessarily the use of the FRELs themselves, but that under the mechanism under which these forest emission reference levels are developed, and there is significant room for different quality of these reference levels, and this has implications when using them in a carbon market context. So one thing that we flagged, for example, in our assessment and with regards to the use of these reference levels, is that there should be a mechanism somewhere in the program rules where it is clear if there is a high uncertainty that is associated with this nationally provided reference levels, then this should be somehow taken into account for the purpose of crediting. So there should be a mechanism either to discount for these uncertainties in order to make the baseline estimations more conservative.
Thank you, Paula. So we are rounding up. Let me take one. There are two from an anonymous attendee, two questions regarding Article 6. Interesting questions. ITMO quality. Since Article 6.2 approaches are more diverse than Article 6.4 PACM, does the quality of an ITMO still matter once it is authorized? Or is authorization considered a pass or fail standard that makes all ITMOs equal? Maybe I'll take that one first, maybe Randall.
Sure. So this is, I think, Fidel Awan, who's the director of the carbon program at GGGI, is on here. She talks a lot about this. So it depends. So in what we call the primary market, in other words, the person who's purchasing something directly from a country or a developer, it does make a difference, right? In the sense that you see some buyers say, we're willing to pay, $30 or $40, but we're only willing to look at, I don't know, energy sector and waste sector projects or something like that. So quality does make a big difference in this primary market. At the same time, it's also true that once something is authorized, an ITMO is an ITMO and in terms of its potential use. So any ITMO from any source can be used to meet an airline's CORSIA requirements. It can also be used to meet NDC requirements. So, once it gets into the secondary market, it has the same use, but I think you'll still see differentiation of the prices in the primary market from these different levels of quality. Also remember, every ITMO has a unique identifier, a serial number, so you actually can track how it was generated, what activity type it is, etc., no matter where it is in the chain, no matter how many times it's sold. So it's even possible that in the longer run, there could be some differentiation. But yeah, in terms of its use, yeah, any ITMO is equal in terms of what it can be used for.
Thank you. Okay, let me go to one question about the renewable energy methodology, since this is the first one about this. From Rosia Rodriguez, in the case of the renewable energy methodology, since these methodologies do not meet the relevant criteria and requirements for CCP approval, how were they evaluated? Maybe Paula?
Randall, do you want to take this?
Yeah. Well, what I can say is, so because we used a similar approach, and I should say, I don't think Vaughn put this in the chat. There are some things in the ICBCM that kind of go beyond what's in the 6.2 guidelines, and we didn't try not to use that, but we still did use many of those. And so what we found I think what you're referring to is that the legacy methodologies from the CDM, which were also used by the other major centers, didn't get the CCP, the ICBCM stamp of approval. In other words, they were regarded as not meeting the core carbon principles. So similarly, when we looked at the one in Colombia, we found that there were gaps, right? So there were many areas where the quantification, for example, was good. The permanence is not an issue for renewables, but on additionality, there were challenges. So we identified similar challenges. What I'm heartened to see is that across the industry, a lot of the standards are working now to improve the methodologies for renewable energy, and I think probably resubmit them to ICBCM. So I think it's possible that this year we might see some renewable energy methodologies that get the CCP stamp of approval.
Okay, so let me have one last question from the of the list. Now that we're maybe just okay. One question about, have you planned to conduct a reassessment to evaluate the improvements? So I can answer that one. I mean, for the time being, no. But precisely the assessment framework is out there also for others to undertake assessments or reassessments. So it is a tool that's available, not just for us, but for the community to undertake these assessments. But maybe if Carbon Limits wants to answer as well, go ahead, Randall.
Sorry, my audio cut off for a second. Can you say that one more
Well,
time?
have you planned to conduct a reassessment to evaluate the improvements?
Yeah, so I mean, as Yvonne said, we don't have plans right now. I think it depends. I mean, if there are any funders on the call here that like to support that, we'd be delighted to do that. But yeah, it is a pretty time-intensive process. It's also, I mean, having been involved with ICBC and myself, I think it's, what we see is that it's an ongoing process, and keeping up with the revisions is also challenging. So I think it would be a good idea, and maybe it's even something that the Colombian government could also try to support. I mean, at the end of the day, the reason this is all important is that when a government submits its reports under the Paris Agreement, its transparency reports, it has to justify that any credits that have been authorized as ITMOs meet these various integrity criteria. So how are they going to do that? So what we're kind of proposing here is that this is one way they could go about doing that. But that means they will have to maintain some form of ongoing assessment process at some level. But that's why. The reason they need it is they actually are required under the Paris Agreement to submit a justification across all the integrity criteria whenever they're saying this is why we authorize these units. So it's important ongoing work, not just for Colombia, but for any country that is thinking about using independent mechanisms, whether they're national or international, for their 6.2 cooperation.
Yes, and on that point, I guess another assessment that will be done is the assessment of the initial report whenever a country uses these mechanisms for their 6.2 agreements. Those will be evaluated by the UNFCCC. And we've seen the initial batch of these assessments with a lot of which showed an important needs for improvement across different parties that were using 6.2, but definitely this is part of the learning curve that the international community is having on 6.2. So we're now coming to the end. We have run out of time. So just a last slide. So all EKI programs must have an independent complaint mechanism, and so you are welcome to any person who believes they may be negatively affected by this EKI supported project or who wishes to report any corruption or misuse of funds can file a complaint. There is the QR code and the instructions to do so. Just I'll leave that a moment there just in case. And in the meantime, I would like to thank all the attendees for all the attention and all the questions, very engaging questions. So please do download the report and read it and comment on it. And thanks again also to all the 3 standards that were consulted and were evaluated and for their cooperation in this process. I know several of you are here in the room. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much. We hope to see you again in some future webinars. So again, there will be an upcoming webinar on the green economy model and Article 6 scenarios using those in March. So with that, I would like to thank all the participants and the panelists, and say goodbye to all of you. Thank you very much.